Palestinians have a state when the settlements have expanded and the water has been appropriated? And how do you end the military occupation, notwithstanding what you had just said earlier?
Yeah. Well, let me start by explaining the reality of the settlements. I'll pose a question, then I'll answer it. By the way, this is my standard. I'm really good at answering my questions. So, take a guess. How much territory do you think the settlements in the West Bank take up? What percent of the West Bank do you think is made up of settlements, Israeli settlements? Take a guess. 10%? The essence of the question implied it's a lot, right? If you listen to the question. In fact, the total territory taken up by the settlements in the West Bank is about 1.7% of the territory. Now, to be fair to the questioner, now for settlers, there are separate roads. So you begin to carve up the West Bank. But if you produce, let's say you could produce an outcome where the borders would take account of what I was describing, settlement blocks and swaps. Maybe the Israelis annex 5% of the West Bank, and then there's a territorial compensation. Well, once you have only blocks, well, then you don't have all these separate roads. You don't carve up the territory that way. So the fact is, it isn't the size of the settlements at this point that puts the two-state outcome at risk. It is basically the location of many. When I say don't build outside the blocks, if you build outside the blocks, it means you're building in the middle of where the Palestinian state would be. Well, then you are carving it up. So if there isn't going to be, if the Israelis were also to say there'll be no Israeli sovereignty to the east of the security barrier. The security barrier is on about 8% of the West Bank. So if you say, okay, no Israeli sovereignty going into negotiations on 92% of the West Bank, then you have something you can talk about. The water issue, I can tell you, when we were dealing with this, when there actually were serious negotiations on these things, we tried to, one of the things I say, and Serge does, this is one of the rules for negotiations and mediation. You asked me to take the 12 and reduce them to 3 or 4. Whenever you can disaggregate a principle and turn it into a practicality, you're always more successful. So long as we were dealing with the question of ownership of water, we had a real hard time. As soon as we went to allocations of water, we were in a different place. There are ways to solve the water problem. They're derivative of, it's all right. It's derivative of solving the larger issue of borders. Once you've solved that, first of all, on the Israeli side, the Israelis, one of the things that's remarkable, if you had peace in this region, there was a time when you had a drought here, up until this last winter, right? Well, so who did the state of California call on to help them with the drought? They brought Israeli specialists in. We have in the Middle East real shortages of water. I don't know how many people are golfers here. There's a golf course in Caesarea, and the Technion created a turf that requires essentially no water. They have created, not just Technion, Ben Gurion University has created drought-resistant crops that require very little water. So there are so many things that could be done if you could break through. You could solve the water problem for the Palestinians as well. And the real issue, as I said, is you have to break through what is the stalemate right now to get back to thinking and being able to stretch our minds about how we come up with creative solutions to all the problems. That basically is stopped. That has to be resumed.
Since Iran basically controls Hamas, do we not need Iran's involvement in working out an agreement between Israel and the Palestinians?
Iran does not control Hamas. Iran controls Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a complete tool of the Iranians, and the proof of that is that it was not in Hezbollah's interest in Lebanon to go into the war in Syria the way they have. And by doing that, they demonstrated that they were whatever Iran commanded, they would do. So Hezbollah is a different story. Hamas, until recently, actually cut off their ties with Iran because it cost them their relationship with the Sunni Arabs. And of course, Hamas was part of the Muslim Brotherhood. So what's happened now is there's a new leadership in Hamas. Ismail Haniyeh has replaced Khalid Mashal, and Yahya Sinwar has become the head within Gaza. And they are resuming their connections to Iran. But there's a big difference between having your connections to Iran and getting money from Iran and being controlled by the Iranians. They're not controlled by the Iranians, and they're very unlikely to be controlled by the Iranians. So if you're talking about affecting Hamas, you actually need Turkey and Qatar. That's who you need.
This was not a question in the list, but given what you just said, I think it's very appropriate. To what degree do you think there is, and how important is, a Sunni-Shia divide?
Well, there is a Sunni-Shia divide. I mean, it's the question to ask is it being driven by these proxy wars, which are also in some ways Arab versus Persian? Is it a national conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran? There's obviously a religious dimension because the Saudis, the king of Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holy mosques. And the Iranians represent a challenge. And so there is a religious dimension. Of course there's a religious dimension. But you could ask the question, what came first? Was it these national conflicts and the competition to see who will dominate the region? The religious overtone is what makes the conflict so much worse. Because it's about truth, and who owns the truth? It's about definition. It's about identity. It's about existence. When you're fighting over identity and existence, it's a total conflict. It's not limited. It becomes something where violence is not limited because it's about existence. So there is a Sunni-Shia dimension. One of the proposals I've made over time, which wasn't adopted by the last administration, and we'll see if the same level of enthusiasm is applied by this administration, was the more we can demonstrate to the Saudis et al., Saudis, Emiratis, and company, that we will be more effective in terms of countering or containing what the Iranians are doing in the region, the more they can have a level of confidence that they don't have to be themselves stoking these sectarian conflicts, because Iran isn't going to be the threat that they saw before. If you want to tamp down the sectarian conflict in the first instance, we have to show that we can affect the Iranian behavior in the region. The logic of what we did in the first term of Obama, which I helped to shape towards Iran, was on the nuclear issue, was the following. We basically said, we will raise the price to the Iranians of their nuclear program, but we will leave them a way out. Whenever you drive somebody into the corner, well, there's no chance they're going to give in. But you have to put, and what we discovered is you got to put enough pressure on them so that they have a reason to look for a way out, and then you have to give them that way out. And they said, just to give you an example of how it worked, the Iranians said throughout the first couple of years of the Obama administration, they would never negotiate so long as they were under sanctions. And we tripled down on the sanctions, and guess what they did? Then they negotiated. Now you can argue about how we negotiated once they began to negotiate. I was myself not particularly enamored with the way we negotiated. I left at the end of 2011, and I felt we had a lot of leverage, and we gave up that leverage. I'm a big believer diplomacy works best when it's backed by leverage. And we had a lot, and we didn't really apply it in the negotiations. But we used the leverage to produce the negotiations. Same logic here. Raise the price to the Iranians of what they're doing in the region, but then also leave them a way out. If we prove ourselves to be effective there, we're then in a very strong position to go to the Saudis and others and say, you have a responsibility too to tamp down the sectarian conflicts.
This next question, I'm a little hesitant, but I think under the circumstances, although it's political, it's a reasonable question. Trump's credibility, certainly at least here and in other parts of the world, has been severely tested or is damaged. We don't even have to argue about that. The question is, given some of his interactions, and I'm thinking of the Australian Prime Minister and some of those things, to what degree do you think that his efforts and outcomes on this trip will be affected negatively by this credibility issue, to the degree that it exists or not?
You know, there's an irony here. In the Middle East, as I was saying, the desire is so strong for the U.S. to stay in the region that if his message is then backed by actions that suggest we will stay in the region, he's not going to have a credibility problem. He'll have a credibility problem if there is a perception that whatever the words are, they're not going to be matched by actions. So in the Middle East, he really doesn't have that problem. That may come, but it will be less a function of what's been going on and more a function of, have we really developed a strategy for not just countering ISIS but also countering Iran, and are we going to maintain the kind of relationship people talk about with our traditional friends in the region? In Europe, it's a little different, where the views of him are clearly, first of all, in the Middle East, being the anti-Obama is highly welcomed. In Europe, being the anti-Obama is not welcome. And so he has two profoundly different audiences that he's dealing with. He won't have much of a problem in the Middle East, given what they hope he represents. In Europe, the challenge will be much more profound. And here, you know, I mean, I think you fall back on institutions. He's going to the NATO summit. And the more it looks like he's investing in NATO, the more that will take the place of maybe some of the things that are going on now.
Some of the best questions are the simplest ones. What about Lebanon?
You know, look, Lebanon sort of muddles through. Hezbollah has a stranglehold over Lebanon. And, you know, they can block anything from happening. If Hezbollah feels sufficient pressure on it, it may go along with, you know, some limited reforms, but one shouldn't have exaggerated expectations.
Did you just say it's becoming Yugoslavia?
I didn't say that, but...
or Syria.
You know, it's not that, because again, they're not fighting each other in Lebanon. I mean, the wars in Lebanon are basically over. But there's profound fear in Lebanon that at some point Hezbollah is going to provoke another conflict with Israel. And that will be a terrible conflict. And the last one was in 2006. So, you know, Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, said after that war, if he'd known how the Israelis had responded, they wouldn't have gone in and kidnapped the Israeli soldiers. So, you know, you could say that deterrence has been established there. And today, look, Hezbollah has the bulk of its fighting force in Syria. It doesn't have an interest in going to war with the Israelis anytime soon. And in some ways, the Iranians don't really have them having an interest in going to war with Israel either. There's enough opposition to Hezbollah in Lebanon because of what they've done in Syria that if there was a war and Hezbollah was dramatically weakened by the Israelis through Israel's military wherewithal, that would make Hezbollah vulnerable to a lot of its enemies within Lebanon itself. So that too creates kind of a damper on their interest in going to war. The problem is this. You know, one never got rich by betting on rationality in the Middle East. Wars take place not always by design. You know, they can take place through inadvertence or through miscalculation. But right now, if I would say, the circumstances make it unlikely that Hezbollah wants to go to war with Israel. And I say the reason there's real trepidation in Lebanon is because Hezbollah has about 120,000 rockets in Lebanon. And they're all in civilian areas. They're in houses, they're in schools, they're next to infrastructure, which means, guess what gets destroyed?
I like this question, particularly because of your experience as a diplomat and having dealt in the White House, and now we all get to see, for better or worse, Trump's negotiating attributes that he's experienced in unions and planning commissions and that sort of thing. Do you believe or feel that his negotiating abilities will or will not be of any advantage to him in that region?
I honestly don't know. Look, one of the things about this conflict is that it's not an avocation, it's a preoccupation. I'll tell you a story. In 2010, we were sitting in the Situation Room, and there was an issue being discussed, and Robert Gates was then the Secretary of Defense, and he said, Dennis's knowledge on this is Talmudic. And President Obama at the time responded by saying, I sometimes think that people can be too consumed by the details. Another way of saying, maybe one shouldn't have such Talmudic knowledge. And I said, you're right. You need a perspective and you can get lost in the details. The problem is the people you're dealing with are lost in the details. And if they don't think you know the details, they will spend all their time trying to educate you. So you won't get to negotiations because they'll be educating you. So I don't expect this president to be deeply involved in the negotiations. I expect he has an envoy. His name is Jason Greenblatt. He has Jared Kushner as well. Greenblatt is the one who is immersing himself in the details, and so I do think that the bulk of the negotiations will be handled probably by Greenblatt and Kushner, and they will get into the details in a way that I wouldn't expect that he would. And to be honest, you want to reserve the president for moments where a dramatic intervention can make the difference. So, the challenge is to get to those moments. They don't just present themselves. And so you have to have a strategy for that. You have to develop that. You have to figure out how you're going to move to a point where you can create a moment where a dramatic intervention can make all the difference, and where you need a combination of tough love and also a promise of rewards. There has to be these negotiations in the end. You're asking these leaders to take on history and mythology. You're asking them to take on the stories that they grew up with. You're asking them to challenge what are the conventional wisdoms of their societies. When I was dealing with the leaders, I used to always feel like I literally could sense the weight of history was on their shoulders. And I'm not sure an American president has ever had to deal with something where the whole identity of a people is caught up in the decisions you make. That's why there has to be a sense that there's a lot to be gained, but there's also something to be lost if you want to cross those historic thresholds.
In this three-dimensional game of chess that you described over there, given what you just discussed about Hezbollah in Lebanon, is there any realistic possibility that Hamas will be ousted from Gaza?
Not anytime soon, which is one of the reasons when you hear people talk about two states, no one can produce it soon because nobody has an answer to Gaza. Israel's not going to go in and remove them. Egypt's not going to go in and remove them. The Palestinian Authority can't go in and remove them. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to show there can be a two-state outcome. First, you have to preserve the possibility of a two-state outcome. Second, you have to be able to produce an agreement that shows that Palestinian national aspirations can be fulfilled, and it would be Hamas that was blocking the achievement. Now, right now, that's a total abstraction. So what you have to be able to do is show it's not an abstraction and show that they're the impediment. Serge is telling you there's a trap door here, and it opens up, and I'm gone.
We're going to switch in a moment, and we're going to brave the idea of having audience ask you questions.
Okay?
We always struggle a little with that because most of us ask questions and some of us give speeches. So for the last question that I'm going to ask you, which may keep you busy for the next 2 or 3 hours, one of my favorite areas. Where do the Kurds in Iraq and Syria fit into this? And, well, yeah, I'm not even, I could answer the question, but it would take me forever.
You know, one of the historical tragedies for the Kurds is that they have always faced significant state opposition. Today, Turkey and Iran don't agree on much, but they agree on one thing: no independent Kurdish state. And they will each exert whatever pressure is required to ensure that's the case. So between Turkey, Iran, Syria, although Syria, as I said, will end up being probably enclaves, and Iraq, I believe what you'll end up seeing is an increasing degree of Kurdish autonomy in a number of different enclaves. Today, one of the reasons that Turkey went into northern Syria was to prevent from a corridor along its border in Syria that basically was contiguous. They went in and they divided it. There are 2 Kurdish enclaves now, divided by what is a Turkish safe area. I have a suspicion that what came out of today's meeting with the president was Erdogan acquiescing in our providing arms for the YPG, not because in the end we said, well, we'll limit how much we provide them, we'll withhold a lot of logistic support, and they won't be able to stay in Raqqa after it's liberated. I don't think that was the payoff. I suspect the payoff was the PKK is trying to establish itself in an area now in the Sinjar Mountains along the Iraqi-Syrian border, and I suspect, I don't know this, but if I were to guess, I suspect that there's a kind of we're giving a free hand to Erdogan to take that out. So my answer to your question is you'll end up not with a Kurdish state. The KRG in northern Iraq will look awfully independent, but it won't be fully independent. And then you'll have other enclaves.
Excellent. Just as an addendum, the Kurds are 4,000 years old. There's an ethnic, specific genetic background. They're the largest stateless group of people in the world. There's almost 40 million of them. And between 1919 and 1920, the Treaty of Sevres and the Treaty of Lausanne, they were guaranteed their own sovereign homeland. So after working for it for 4,000 years, essentially, and having been denied it, they're just not a happy people right now. Having said that, let's open it up for some questions. Please. I'm going to walk around. Where are we starting? Okay.
Mr. Ambassador, many people in the United States wonder if maybe we'd be better off just stepping out of the region and letting them solve it. Could you comment on that?
Yep. Look, I think the easiest way to understand the Middle East is that the Las Vegas rules do not apply. Meaning what takes place in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. If you want a good example of the impact of that, look at Syria. Where did Brexit come from? The refugees flowing out of Syria produced Brexit, raised fundamental questions about the survivability of the EU, which is an important partner of the United States. We are not in a position where if we simply withdraw, that the problems of the region will go away. What will happen is there'll be vacuums. I mean, there are two ways to create vacuums. We created a vacuum in Iraq. We replaced the regime and we had no plan for what came afterwards. In Syria, we helped to create the vacuum because we weren't willing to do anything. Vacuums in the Middle East are always filled by the worst possible forces. And those worst possible forces, they won't stay there. ISIS was already creating basically a factory to produce terrorists to go to Europe and here. If these kinds of groups are able to fill the vacuums, they will then be in a position where they will plan their operations, and we will not be immune. And our mere existence is seen by them as a threat. If we fight them, some people say if you fight them, that's why you have a problem. If we don't fight them, they're going to fight us. They have a belief system where our mere existence threatens them. And so first there's the issue that what takes place there won't stay there. Second, there's the issue of every time we're not involved, or we take a step back, vacuums tend to emerge. And we see who fills them. And the third issue is we can say we're energy independent, but there's only one pool of energy worldwide. So if there's a great disruption there, and 20 to 25% of the energy of the world is coming out of there, and suddenly that's disrupted, well, that means the price of energy is bid way up. We may still have it here, but the price will be dramatically higher. But it also means the world economy is fundamentally affected. So we're not immune from that either. So it might be desirable to say, who wants to be part of these messes? I get it. But there's also a reality, and that reality, unfortunately, has been demonstrated over and over again. Now, having said that, we also have to be smarter about how and where we choose to involve ourselves. We cannot, regime change is not something that you can do from the outside. We can't do nation building unless there are partners there who are credible, who need our help. The idea that we can do nation building, that we can do it from the outside, again, is an illusion. But you look at places, I'll give you a country, not in the Middle East, but has been very successful because of our role, Colombia. Colombia has been completely transformed. And it was because they were prepared to do the hard things internally themselves, and we were prepared to help them. But you have to have a local partner who has credibility and commitment. If you don't have that, then what your role should basically be is anti-terror. I'll tell you one other point on this. At the beginning of the Obama administration, there was a big debate over what we should do in Afghanistan. As you recall, when he ran in 2008, he basically said Iraq was the bad war, Afghanistan was the good war. And the debate went through into the fall. And Vice President Biden said, look, it's a mistake to do nation building here. It's a mistake to engage in a big counterinsurgency. Our approach shouldn't be counterinsurgency. Our approach should be counterterror. The difference between the two was a dramatic difference in terms of the scope of the American presence on the ground. Counterterror, you do with a small footprint. Counterinsurgency, you need a serious presence. We went for counterinsurgency. Part of the problem is we have been trying to remake Afghanistan. Afghanistan historically has always been decentralized. And we tried to centralize it. Now we also, apropos of what you said is true, we never effectively dealt with Pakistan. Pakistan gave a sanctuary to the Taliban, and I don't care what war you're dealing with. If there's a sanctuary for a group that can always go back and regroup, rebuild, you're going to have a major problem. So anyway, the point is, we have to be smarter how we do this. But being smarter doesn't mean walking away.
Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. This
Yep.
discussion about the Middle East reminds me of my favorite axiom. There's no situation, no matter how bad it is, that it can't be made worse.
Somebody down here has a question.
Can you comment on today's news that Al Qaeda, under the leadership of Bin Laden's son, and ISIS are getting together?
There has been. Look, there are areas where there have been groups that have been identified with Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda and ISIS split. The two different concepts of what is required. Not that, look, they both think that there should be a caliphate. The question is, Al Qaeda's view was you don't prepare a caliphate until the ground is set, whereas the Islamic State said you create the caliphate now. And so there was a basic split between them. But if you look at some of the groups, some of those in the groups basically have been together. There are personal networks, there are networks of people who have known each other, kind of grew up together, got recruited together, and so what you're seeing more than anything else, you're seeing that. You're seeing some of these groups where there were natural linkages, you're seeing them, in a sense, fall back on their natural linkages.
What would you do in Afghanistan if you were the President of the United States of America?
Well, thankfully I'm not. Look, I think that we've had a lot of efforts over the years to try to affect the Pakistanis, and we haven't succeeded. And it's not for want of trying. I mean, I've seen it through different administrations. I've seen different pressure put on. I've seen different inducements offered. We have to be careful how we deal with that with Pakistan as well, because we are also not interested in destabilizing a country that has a significant number of nuclear weapons. And we're also not interested in seeing any conflict between Pakistan and India that could escalate. I understand the desire to prevent the Taliban from being able to retake most of the country. What I'm worried about is, there's, depending upon how you count, it looks like they now control more than half of the country after having lost most of it. The casualties that the Afghan police force in particular take are very high. Part of the problem, maybe a major part of the problem, is just the kind of embedded corruption. There's been a constant effort to try to deal with that, but I mean, my own sense would be there comes a point where we really do have to decide, when is enough enough? When do we kind of revert to focusing only on a kind of counter-terror strategy, what Biden was focused on? It doesn't make me feel good to say it, because the Taliban, you look at Afghanistan, the advance in education, especially for women and girls, has been dramatic. And I'd hate to see that reversed. So what I'm suggesting is this is a terrible dilemma. But the idea that here we are 16 years into this, after several years where it looked like we were making progress, it doesn't look like we're making progress now, just the opposite. There's a part of me that asks, who trains the Taliban? Right?
Or as Kenny Rogers said, you've got to know when to hold them. You've got to know when to fold them.
Well, there's something to that.
Last question before Serge closes.
I want to know, did you find the JCPA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a good move and the proper decision that President Obama made?
I never supported it because I had problems with, not with the fact that it didn't achieve something. Look, the JCPOA was good and bad. When I talked to the president, and the president, he wanted me to support it because obviously I had a certain credibility in this issue, having helped to shape the approach in the first term. I fully acknowledge that the JCPOA, if implemented, buys you 15 years. It does. People who said it doesn't buy that, they're not really looking at what the terms of it are. The problem is that after 15 years, there's no limitation on the size or the quality of the nuclear infrastructure that the Iranians can have. And what that means is the gap between their threshold status as a nuclear infrastructure state and what it would take to have a weapon is very small. Which means you are deferring their nuclear weapons option. You're not stopping their nuclear weapons option. So I had 5 conditions that if they were met, I would have supported the JCPOA. And they were built around the idea of bolstering our deterrence. Because I don't want the Iranians somewhere down the line to start being tempted to say, gee, you know what? We can present the world with a fait accompli. It'll take us very little time as you get by years 13, 14, 15 to be able to move very quickly to a weapon. Let's just present the world with a fait accompli. They can't do anything about it. So I wanted us to do a number of things that would have conveyed to the Iranians that if they violated the understanding, there is a commitment they make in it to never seek, acquire, or develop nuclear weapons. So if we see they're actually doing that, I wanted us to declare that we would act militarily and destroy their nuclear infrastructure. I wanted to put them on notice. I wanted them to be on notice. I wanted the world to be on notice. This is what would happen, so everybody gets used to it. I wanted us to say, because after year 15, they can produce highly enriched uranium. Weapons-grade uranium is purified, enriched to 80-90%. For 15 years, they can only enrich to 3.67%. But after year 15, they can enrich to 90%. Again, what it means is no gap. So I want us to say, if we see them producing highly enriched uranium, that would be a trigger. I wanted us to give the Israelis something called the massive ordnance penetrator. You've heard about the big bomb that was used in Afghanistan. That was the airburst version of this, which is 22,000 pounds. The massive ordnance penetrator is 30,000 pounds. I want us to give it to the Israelis because there's one of the enrichment sites is built into a mountain, and the Israelis don't have the means to take it out. We developed this, a non-nuclear, conventional bomb that has a fuse that doesn't ignite until it's deep underground, so we could take it out. I wanted to give it to the Israelis and the means to carry it, because they don't have a plane big enough to carry it, because the Iranians might doubt what we say, but they wouldn't doubt that the Israelis would ask. And if they also saw that we were prepared to give it to the Israelis, it would signal that we would support the Israelis doing it. I wanted us to make it clear that if we saw an increase in the monies after sanctions were lifted, and they had access to about $50 billion, if we saw an increase in the support they were giving to Hezbollah and the other Shia militias, that we would impose new sanctions, not on the nuclear issue, but on their behavior in the region. So they would see there was a cost to it. And I wanted us to work out with the Europeans an understanding that if the Iranians cheated along the margins, in advance, we would agree to a set of penalties we would impose that would be proportional to cheating that's basically small cheating. You don't go to war over cheating along the margin. But you also have to impose a price for cheating along the margin, because this is the way they erode the idea of responding to cheating. So those were my 5 conditions, and they weren't met. So I didn't support the JCPOA. But to be fair, I didn't oppose it either, because I thought the worst of all worlds would be if you actually blocked it, then the other members of the 5+1 would still adhere to it. Iran would present itself as the victim. They'd have the best of all worlds. Just like now, I don't want us walking away from the JCPOA, but I want us to bolster it the way I was suggesting. If we do that, then you plug in my mind, one of the big holes or big vulnerabilities. If you tear it up, you make us the issue. I want their bad behavior to be the issue, not our behavior. I don't want us to be the issue.
Speaking of cheating, yeah, speaking of cheating, we have one more question.
Prerogative up in front. So,
Thank you, Ambassador.
Here we go.
I want to give her a chance to ask a
Okay.
question.
What is Russia's and China's affiliation with Syria?
What is Russia's what?
Russia's affiliation and China with Syria. I guess the connection.
Russia and China. and
Because I
Syria.
know they're included like Syria's war.
Well, look, I think China and Russia are very different in Syria. I mean, one example being that the Russians protected the Syrians after their use of chemical weapons. They vetoed the Security Council resolution. The Chinese abstained on it, first time that they differed with the Russians on that. So their position on Syria isn't the same. The Russians, I was saying it before, for the Russians, Putin wants to look like he's the arbiter of events. He wants to show that he made the difference and he determined the outcome there. That's why I was saying, you want to affect his interest, make it clear to him that the price is going to go up in Syria. And by the way, we can do that. I mean, look, the easiest way to do it is just to sort of say to him, look, you're stuck. You want Syria? You want what you produced? You got it. Don't look to us to help out. Now, there's other things that are riskier we could do. We could, if they don't impose on Assad, the agreement that they worked out with Turkey and Iran creates 4 de-escalation zones where the 3 of them will monitor what's going on and will create checkpoints. They say they will stop the Syrian Air Force from flying in those areas. The problem is there's a huge loophole. And the huge loophole is that the Syrian regime remains free to attack those they consider terrorists. Of course, Assad considers everybody who's against him a terrorist. But, they'll say Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda groups that are there, the Al-Nusra Front. The problem is there's a lot of co-location because they became the most effective fighters. So, I fully expect that the Assad regime will absolutely try to exploit the loophole. And look, you saw the news yesterday not about exploiting the loophole, but they have crematoriums. I mean, it is inconceivable that there are crematoriums. Have we learned no lessons from the past? The guy is a war criminal, and we should make it clear we're going to pursue that. By the way, the more you emphasize that to the Russians, the more the Russians actually have an interest in finding a way out. People think, gee, if you put more pressure on the Russians, they'll just dig in. No, they won't. One of the things about Putin is transactional. It's all cost benefit. People who think Putin's a big risk taker, you don't go into conflicts with little green men if you're a big risk taker. He does this as a way of testing if there's going to be a response. And when he sees there's no response, then he goes in. We so often self-deterred that we gave him a free hand. I was in a discussion, I guess I can't say who this was with, but I can say it was a senior Egyptian official. And he said, I asked him a question about the role of the Russians, and he said in response, don't complain if countries in the region feel they have to deal with the Russians. You're the ones who created the vacuum and allowed them to walk right in.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for that excellent presentation. The wealth of knowledge and experience is self-evident, so thank you very much for that insightful and informative presentation. We're blessed and very thankful, appreciative of that, Ambassador Ross. I just hope Kushner and the other fellow,
Greenblatt.
they take you along with them.
Well, they're not taking me along with it, but that's okay.
They should. But anyway, you're a valuable asset to our country, so thank you very much for your service.
My pleasure.
And on behalf of the World Affairs Council, let's get the right one here. Present your gift. It's a golden, it's an orange award. It's crystal, and to remember our council and remember this evening. So
Thank you very much.
and if we can have a picture together.
Sure.
Ambassador. Thank you. I think that our country has the best foreign service, the best diplomats in the world, and they're dedicated for the interest of our country. And Ambassador Ross is an example, a model of those civil servants and foreign service officers who dedicate their lives to what they believe in.